Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming in person and through Zoom to today's noon lecture by Professor Takahiro Sasaki of Keio University. My name is Keiko Yokotakata. I'm a Japanese studies librarian at Asian Library. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I have a couple announcements from the Center for Japanese Studies. Tonight, starting at 7:15 p.m., the State Theater. The State Theater will streaming the film Seven Samurai, directed by Akira Kurosawa. This is a part of the center's Diamonds by the Decade, the best of CJA's 75th anniversary film series, which showcases Japanese films from each decade of the center's existence. Seven Samurai will represent the 1950s in this series. Next week, CJS will hold another noon lecture titled Kaze to Tomo ni Sarinu as Jidai Shousetsu, the 1938 Japanese translation of Gone with the Wind, to be given by Professor Jim Reichert of the Department of East Asia Languages and Cultures at Stanford University. Please check our CJS events page or various social media for CJS lectures series scheduled for fall 2022. For those attendees joining the webinar, webcams and microphones have been muted, but we invite you to use the question and answer function during the lecture to submit any questions you have. The presenters will try to address as many as possible. The live transcription, closed caption will be enabled, but if you would rather not have it, just go to the bottom right corner and disable it. Now, allow me to introduce our speaker. We are very honored to have a special guest from Japan, Professor Takahiro Sasaki of the Institute of Oriental Classics at Keio University. He's a very prominent scholar, globally recognized for his work focused on Japanese pre-modern books. His academic career started in 1985 when he graduated from Faculty of Letters at Keio University, where he later completed his master's and PhD. After serving as a research associate at the National Institute of Japanese Literature, he returned to Keio University, becoming a full-time professor in the Institute of Oriental Classics. He later served as the director of the institute from 2018 until September 2022, and is now devoted to research as a professor. Professor Sasaki is a member of Association of Waka Poetry Studies and the Academy of Middle Age Literature. In 1995, he was awarded the 21st Annual Japan Classic Literature Foundation Prize and was selected for the Keio Prize from Keio University in 2016. He was also chosen for the 39th Kadokawa Genyoshi Prize in Literature in 2017. Professor Sasaki specializes in medieval Japanese waka poetry and bibliography. If you don't mind, I'd like to read a quote about his work from the Keio Times in September of 2019. Quote, "He brings an indispensable point of view to the Japanese classics, one formally based in the field of bibliography, which sits at the intersection of physical material and cultural context. The assessment of a work is often dependent on when it was made and by whom. And as a leading expert in the field, Professor Sasaki is well versed in the Japanese classics. End quote. His research is contributing to the knowledge of classical Japanese literature around the world. He has worked with the Metropolitan Museum, British Library, Art Institute of Chicago, Smithsonian Institute, and more. He has been also invited for lectures at universities in Europe and the United States, including Ivy League schools, University of Hawaii, UC Berkeley, and recently at the University of Washington at the end of October. Now, Michigan. I am very happy, honored to have Professor Sasaki at this noon lecture, sponsored by the Center for Japanese Studies. Today, he will give you his lecture in Japanese, but we will have a simultaneous interpretation as well.
It's consecutive interpreting. Yeah.
Okay. For our English interpreter, I would like to introduce Ms. Izumi Suzuki of Suzuki Myers and Association. She's a world-class interpreter with a legal interpretation certificate and has worked with major business figures, including the president of Toyota. Japanese classic books are very rich in history and variety. The scope of these works cannot be fully explored in just 1 hour. But today, Professor Sasaki will surely open your eyes to the world of pre-modern Japanese books. Please join me welcoming Professor Takahiro Sasaki. どうぞよろしくお願いします。
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. ここから日本語でお話しいたします。
From here, I will talk in Japanese.
皆さんこんにちは。日本の東京にある慶応大学の東アジアの書物を研究する指導文庫という研究所の教授をしている佐々木隆弘です。私は日本の書物史が専門で、特に書物の形態と書物に保存される内容の相関関係について研究しています。本日は北米の日本研究の重要な拠点であるミシガン大学において、日本の書物について皆さんにお話しできますことを大変光栄に存じます。
Hello, everyone. I'm Takahiro Sasaki. I'm a professor at Shido Bunko, Keio University Institute of Oriental Classics in Tokyo, Japan. The institute studies East Asian books. I specialize in the history of Japanese books, and I especially study the correlation between book forms and the contents preserved in books. I feel very honored to be given this opportunity to talk to you about Japanese books at the University of Michigan, which is an important base for the Japan study in North America.
書物はそれが作られ保存されてきた国や地域の文化の象徴的な存在です。書物の内容はもちろんですが、その形態や作り方、デザインや色などにも注目すると、その国や地域の文化を深く理解することができます。日本の前近代の書物の特徴は、形態やデザイン、色などが非常に多彩であることです。日本の書物は中国や朝鮮半島の影響を強く受けているのに、この特徴は日本独自のものと言えます。ここに東アジアにおける日本の独自性があると言えます。なぜ日本の古い書物は種類が豊富なのでしょうか。現代の日本を見てみても、一つのものの種類が多いことを好む文化を有していることは確かだと思います。中国から伝わったラーメンやイギリスから伝わったお菓子のキットカットの種類の多さをご存知の方も多いのではないでしょうか。
Books are symbolic existence of culture belonging to countries and regions where such books have been made and preserved. Of course, the content of a book is important, but also paying attention to its form and how it is made, as well as design and colors, give us deeper understanding of the culture of that country or region. The characteristic of pre-modern books of Japan is that there are a huge variety of forms, design, and colors. Even though Japanese books have been strongly influenced by those of China and the Korean Peninsula, this characteristic is unique to Japan. This shows the uniqueness of Japan in East Asia. Then why do old Japanese books have such a variety? Looking at modern Japan, I am certain that it has a culture that prefers a variety of one thing. I suppose many of you may know that there are a variety of ramen that came from China, or Kit Kat that came from England.
そうなったことと直接の関係があるかどうかは不明ですが、日本語は文字と発音の種類が多い言語で、それが日本語を学ぶ難しさの理由の一つともなっています。日本語は中国から伝わった表意文字である漢字、漢字から生まれた2種類の表音文字であるカタカナとひらがなという3種類の文字を用います。また漢字には複数の読み方が存在します。中国語の発音を伝えた音、漢字の意味に相当する日本語である訓の2種に分かれるのです。しかも3種の音を有する漢字もあり、2種有するものも珍しくありません。漢字の音はその漢字を用いるものや知識が中国から伝わった時の中国の発音を保存しているのです。漢字の音の多さは日本が中国から長い年月にわたって文化的な影響を何度も受けていることを示していると言えるでしょう。これからお話しするように、日本では書物の想定の種類が多いのですが、これも音と同じく中国で発明された想定が何度も日本に伝わって日本で保存され使用され続けたからだと考えられます。このことは古い書物の残存数に限りがある中国の書物の歴史を考える上で、日本の書物が役に立つ可能性のあることをも示しているのです。
It's unclear if there is a direct relationship to this, but the Japanese language has many types of letters and sounds or pronunciations, which is one reason that it is not easy to learn Japanese. Japanese uses 3 types of letters: kanji, or Chinese characters, which is ideograph that came from China, and katakana and hiragana, 2 types of phonograms born from kanji. And there are multiple ways of pronunciations for each kanji. They are classified as on, which came from Chinese sound, and kun, which is equivalent to the meaning of a character in Japanese. On top of it, some kanji have 3 different ons, and quite many have 2 of them. On preserves pronunciations of Chinese characters of eras which things or knowledge which use that particular kanji was introduced to Japan. Multiple on represents the fact that Japan has been culturally influenced by China many times for a long, long time. As I am going to mention soon, there are a variety of book bindings in Japan. The reason is similar to on. Bindings that were invented in China were introduced to Japan many times, and they are continuously preserved and used in Japan. This means that there is a possibility that Japanese books would be useful in considering the history of books in China, where the number of remaining old books are quite limited.
日本で作られた現存最古の書物は7世紀とされますが、8世紀以降の書物が数多く存在しています。それらを見渡すと、主に5種類の想定が用いられていることが分かります。漢数層、織本層、列長層、鉄葉層、袋とじ層がそれで、この順序で中国から伝わったと考えられます。1、2、3が紙と糊を用いて作るもので、4、5は紙に穴を開けて糸や紐を通して作るものです。3、4、5は冊子本と呼べる形態です。3、4が紙の表と裏両面を使うもので、1、2は裏を使う場合もあります。 5は紙の表しか使用できないものです。
The oldest books made in Japan are preserved to this day, are thought to be those from the 7th century. But there are many books in existence from the 8th century on. Looking over these books, you can tell that mainly 5 types of bindings are used. Kansusho, Orihonso, Kansuso, Orihonso, Dechoso, 鉄要素 and 袋とじ so. It is considered they were introduced from China in that order. 1, 2, and 3 are made with the use of paper and glue. 4 and 5 are made with making holes in paper and use thread or string to bind them together. 3, 4, and 5 can be called sashi or booklet. Both front and back sides of paper are used for 3 and 4, and sometimes the back side is used in 1 and 2. With 5, only the front side of paper could be used.
1の関数層は紙を糊で貼り付いて長くし巻いて保存する想定です。紙を使用した最も古い想定です。日本では7世紀のものが最古と言われますが、8世紀以降のものが数多く現存しています。
Number 1 kansuso is a binding where paper is made long by gluing it together and preserved as a roll. This is the oldest binding method using paper. It is said that the oldest ones are from the 7th century, but there are many from the 8th century on in existence.
これは指導文庫にある8世紀の仏教書です。
This is a Buddhist book of the 8th century that Shido Bunko has.
2の折り本層はやはり紙を糊で貼り付いて長くしたものを折りたたんで保存する想定です。日本最古の例は11世紀のものですが、もっと前から使用されていた可能性があります。この想定は仏教と縁の深い想定であったと考えられ、そのためもあってか普通の読み物が保存されることは基本的にありませんでした。ちょっと特殊な想定であると言えます。
Number 2 orihonso is a binding style in which paper is also glued to make it long and folded in order to preserve. The example in existence is from the 11th century, but it could have been used before that. This binding is thought to have strong connection with Buddhism, and maybe because of that, general reading materials were basically not preserved this way. Therefore, we can say this is somewhat special binding.
これは指導文庫にある14世紀に印刷されたお経です。
This is a sutra printed in the 14th century that Shido Bunko has.
3の絶頂層は紙を縦に半分に折ったものを重ねて折り目近くで糊付けして冊子にするものです。9世紀のごく初めに留学僧が中国から持ち帰ったものが現存しています。麦や米を使って作られた糊は虫害に弱いので、13世紀以降は仏書を除いてあまり使われなくなります。
Number 3 dechoso is a binding where sheets of paper are folded vertically in halves, layered and put into a book form by gluing them near the folding lines. A book that a Japanese monk who had studied in China brought back in the very beginning of the 9th century still exists. Glue made of wheat or rice is susceptible to insects, so this binding became unpopular after the 13th century except for Buddhist books.
これは指導文庫にある1136年の仏教関係の写本ですが、糊しろ部分が虫に食われています。
This is a manuscript related to Buddhism from 1136 that is housed in Shido Bunko, and you can see that the pasted margin has been eaten by insects.
これも指導文庫にある13世紀の写本の糊で貼り合わせた部分を撮影したものです。糊が剥がれるとバラバラになるという欠点も有しています。
This is another manuscript from the 13th century at Shido Bunko with the paste margin shown. It also has a weak point that loss of glue causes a book to disintegrate.
4の鉄要素は10枚以下の紙を重ねて縦に半分に折ったものを2つ以上用意し、折り目に開けた穴に糸を通してつなげて冊子にするものです。今日特に注目したい想定です。11世紀頃から使用されたと考えられます。糊を多用しないので酸よりは虫に強く、13世紀から16世紀頃まで日本の冊子体の代表的な存在でした。
Number 4, tetsuyoso is a binding where more than 2 sets of 10 or less sheets of paper are layered and folded vertically in halves and threaded through holes that are made along the folding line to put together and made into a book. This is the binding that should be paid attention to today. They are considered to be used from around the 11th century. Since not so much glue is used, it is not as susceptible to insects as number 3, and it was a representative binding of Japanese books from the 13th to 16th century.
これは日本の国宝に指定されている1120年に書写された和歌集の写本です。中国から輸入された雲母の粉で模様が印刷された装飾紙が用いられています。
This is a book of the collection of waka or Japanese traditional poems, hand-copied in 1120, and it is designated a national treasure. It uses decorative paper on which a pattern is printed with mica powder imported from China.
これは指導文庫にある1480年の写本の下の部分を斜めから撮影したものです。紙を重ねて折ったものを4つ確認できます。
This photo was of the bottom part of the manuscript in 1480 that Shido Bunko has, taken from a diagonal angle. You can observe 4 bunches of folded paper.
凸頂層と鉄要素は長方形と正方形の2つのタイプに分類できます。これは鉄要素の例です。
Dechoso and tetsuyoso can be classified into 2 types, rectangular ones and square ones. This is an example of tetsuyoso.
使用する紙を縦長にして高さの半分で水平に切断したものを重ねて縦に半分に折ると縦型になります。高さを3等分してその部分で水平に切断したものを重ねて縦に半分に折るとほぼ正方形になります。この両者は保存する内容の傾向に違いが認められ、長方形の方が公式性が高いと考えられます。
Place paper to use vertically long, cut horizontally at the half of its height. Layer them and fold into halves vertically. Then you end up with vertical pieces. When the height is divided into 3 equal lengths, cut horizontally at folding lines, layer such pieces and fold into halves vertically, then you end up with approximately square pieces. There is a difference in the tendency of contents preserved in these 2 types, and it is considered the rectangular type is more official.
5の袋閉じ層は紙を縦半分に折るのは同じですが、同様に折ったものを必要枚数重ね、折り目と反対側の部分に穴を開け、紐や糸で閉じて冊子にするものです。構造的に紙の表しか使用できません。やはり11世紀頃からの使用が確認できます。日本では写本の例も多く確認できますが、日本だけでなく中国や朝鮮半島、あるいはベトナムなどの版本でよく使用された想定であり、東アジアを代表する想定であると言えるでしょう。
Number 5, fukurotoji so has the same characteristic of folding paper into a half, but a necessary number of pieces are layered, holes are made on the opposite side of the folding side, bound together with thread or strings to make a book. Structurally, only the front side of paper can be used. We could also confirm that such types have been used since the 11th century. We see many examples of manuscripts this way in Japan, but this is a type of binding often used for published books in China, the Korean Peninsula, Vietnam, and so on. So this can be said a representative binding in East Asia.
これは指導文庫にある17世紀の初めに木製のひらがなの活字で印刷された物語の本です。この活字印刷がきっかけになって日本では商業出版が発達し、膨大な数の書物が刊行されましたが、そのほとんどがこの想定で作られましたので、日本人も日本の古い書物というとこの想定をイメージするはずだと思われます。
This is a storybook printed with wooden hiragana type printed in the beginning of the 17th century, owned by Shido Bunko. This type printing triggered the development of commercial publishing in Japan, and a huge number of books were published. Most of them used this binding, so when Japanese people think of Japanese old books, they should think of this binding.
日本では以上の中国から伝わったと考えられる5種類の想定が11世紀以降同時並行的に用いられたのです。中国や朝鮮半島でもこれらは使用されたはずなのですが、現存する古い書物のほとんどは中国では戦争と呼ばれる袋とじ草のものです。中国や朝鮮半島では早くから漢本が書物の中心的な存在となり、漢本の量産に最も適していたことから、この想定が他の想定を駆逐する形となったと考えられます。日本にも8世紀に印刷術は伝わっていましたが、量産を必要とする仏教書を中心に利用されただけで、漢本が写本の地位を脅かすことはありませんでした。写本では制作の目的に応じて想定を選択していたことが、想定と内容の関係の確認から判明しています。想定にはヒエラルキーが存しており、それに応じた使い分けが行われていたのです。
In Japan, those 5 bindings thought to be introduced from China were used simultaneously after the 11th century. They must have been used in China and the Korean Peninsula too, but most of the existing old books are of fukuro tojiso, which is called senso. In China and the Korean Peninsula, published books became the central existence in early days, and since it was most appropriate for mass-produced books, this binding is thought to be drive away other bindings. Printing technology was also introduced to Japan in the 8th century, but it was utilized only mainly for Buddhist books that needed mass production. Therefore, published books never threatened the position of manuscripts. It is proven that in manuscripts, a binding was selected according to the purpose of publication by checking the relationship between bindings and contents. A hierarchy existed in bindings, and usage was selected based on that.
用いられ方が特殊な2の折本草と13世紀頃から仏教書以外ではあまり使用されなくなる3の絶頂草を除いて、想定のヒエラルキーを整理するとこのようになります。最も格式が高いのが1の関数層で、利用の目的は限られ、保存する内容も選ばれました。冊子本の中で格が高いのが4の鉄要層で、その中でも長方形の方が正方形よりも格上であったと考えられます。5の袋とじ層が最下位となりますが、どのような内容でも保存できる便利な想定でもあったのです。
Excluding number 2 orihonso, of which usage was special, and number 3 dechoso, which was not used much after the 13th century except for Buddhist books. The hierarchy of bindings could be organized as follows. The highest class was number 1, kansusho, so, of which purpose of usage was limited, and the content to preserve was also selected. High-class binding among booklets was number 4, tetsuyoso, and the rectangular ones were thought to be higher than the square ones. Fukurotojiso was the lowest class among the 5, but it was also a convenient binding that could preserve any content.
日本の書物を理解するには基本となる 5種類の想定の特徴とその使い分けの在り方を知ることが重要になります。また日本の書物に注目することは中国や朝鮮半島の書物を理解することにもつながります。度重なる王朝交代や戦乱などのためにこれらの国では古い書物、特に写本の現存するものが極めて少なく、古い時代の書物を研究する材料が少ないという問題があります。中国で著述されながら中国国内では失われてしまった作品が日本国内で残存している例は少なくありません。それらには書物自体も中国のものと、書物は日本で作られたものとがあります。これは日本に伝わって残った中国の書物の例です。
In order to understand Japanese books, it is important to know the characteristics of the basic 5 bindings and their usages. Also, paying attention to Japanese books is linked to understanding books from China and the Korean Peninsula. Due to repeated changes of dynasties and maelstrom of wars, old books, especially manuscripts, rarely survived in those countries. And the problem exists that there are few materials to study books from old eras. There are quite a few books that were written but lost in China and have existed in Japan. Among them, there are books which themselves were from China and those that were made in Japan. This is an example of a Chinese book introduced from China to Japan.
こちらは日本人が書写したことで作品が残った例です。
This is an example of a work that survived to this day by being hand-copied by a Japanese.
この他に中国の宋現代の版本でも中国には確認できないものが日本にある例も少なくありません。また版本はどこにも残っていないものの、中国の版本を日本人が写した写本が残っている場合も知られています。この本は現存しない中国の1197年漢本の日本人による写本です。以上のような事例は朝鮮半島の書物でも確認されています。
Besides these, there are quite a few examples of published books in the Song Dynasty and the Yuan Dynasty of China, which cannot be confirmed of their existence in China, but exist in Japan. It is also known that even though published books don't exist anywhere, some Chinese published books hand-copied by Japanese people exist. This book is a manuscript by Japanese of now non-existent Chinese published book in 1197. Similar examples have been confirmed with books from the Korean Peninsula.
このように日本に存在する書物を通して中国や朝鮮半島で失われた作品を知ることができ、それとともにそれらの国々の書物の形態や作り方を知ることができたりするのです。その事例を一つだけご紹介します。先ほど説明した4の鉄要素は大和とじとも呼ばれました。中国や朝鮮半島に同じ想定の本が存在しないことから、日本で生まれた想定と考えられていたようです。これは16世紀初めとやや新しい本ですが、伝統的な作りのものです。
Like this, through books that exist in Japan, we could know works that were lost in China and the Korean Peninsula, and we can learn forms and fabrication method of such books. Let me introduce just one such example. Number 4, Tetsuyoso, that I explained earlier, was also called Yamato Toji. It seems that this was considered a binding born in Japan, since no books of the same binding existed in China or the Korean Peninsula. This is somewhat newer book from the beginning of the 16th century with traditional fabrication.
構造がよくわかるように撮影した画像がこちらです。
This photo was taken to show the structure clearly.
今ではこの想定は日本特有のものでなかったことが明らかになっています。それは世紀の大発見によって判明しました。その発見とは1900年にあの有名な敦煌文献が岩山の横穴から偶然に発見されたことです。4世紀後半から11世紀前半までの大量の書物や文書が発見されたのです。 これらの資料の価値は、敦煌学という学問分野が成立したことにも明らかです。書物のことに限っても、それまでにほとんど確認されていなかった想定の本も少なからず発見されたことは、大きな驚きをもって受け止められました。膨大な1の関数層に混じって、2の折本層や3の絶頂層のものなども発見されています。
Now we know this binding was not unique to Japan. It was proven by a big discovery of the century. The discovery we are talking about here is the coincidental discovery of the famous Dan-Wan literature in the side hall of a rocky hill in 1900. Many books and documents from the latter half of the 4th century to the first half of the 11th century were discovered. The value of these materials is clear from the fact that the academic field called Dan-Wanology was created. Just by limiting to books, discovery of many books bound in ways that had not been confirmed before was received with big surprise. Mixed with a huge number of books of number 1 Kansuso, books of number 2 Orihonso, and number 3 Dechoso were discovered.
これは大英図書館に所蔵される10世紀後半の仏教経典の写本ですが、その基本的な構造は日本の鉄要層と同じなのです。中国ではこの想定を法鉄層と呼んでいます。ただしこれは日本語的な発音ですのでご注意ください。
This is a manuscript of Buddhist Sutra from the latter half of the 10th century that belongs to the British Museum, and its basic structure is the same as the Japanese Tetsuyoso. In China, this binding is called Hotetsu, but this is a Japanese pronunciation, so be careful.
こちらも大英図書館蔵の10世紀の仏教経典の写本で鉄要素と同じ構造をしています。こうした本が複数発見されたことにより、日本の鉄要素もやはり中国で発明されて日本に伝わったと考えられるようになったのです。しかしそれで問題がすべて解決したわけではありません。敦煌はヨーロッパと東アジアを結ぶ有名な交通路であるシルクロードの要衝にある都市であるからです。
This one is also a manuscript of Buddhist Sutra from the 10th century that belongs to the British Museum and has the same structure as Tetsuyoso. Because a multiple number of such books were discovered, now the Japanese Tetsuyoso is considered something that was invented in China and introduced to Japan. However, this has not solved all the problems because Danghuan is a city located in a strategic place of Silk Road, the famous traffic route which connects Europe and East Asia.
すでにお気づきの方も多いと思いますが、この想定は西洋のコデックスとよく似ています。ここでは構造が分かりやすいので、16世紀初めとやや新しいのですが、エチオピアのコデックスの画像を示します。エチオピアの写本は西洋の古い製本の仕方をよく伝えているものとして知られています。厚さなどは違いますが、紙、ここでは羊皮紙も含めてこう言いますが、を何枚か重ねて折ったものをいくつか用意して、紙に穴を開けて糸を通して閉じていることは、東アジアもアフリカを含めた西洋も共通しています。閉じ穴の数や糸の通し方に違いがありますが、それは紙の丈夫さや本の厚さに応じて改変していったものと考えられます。
I think many of you have already noticed that this binding is very similar to the Western Europe's codex. Here, I'm showing an Ethiopian codex from the first half of the 16th century. A bit new, but the structure is easy to see with this one. Ethiopian manuscripts are known as the ones that pass down the old binding method of Western Europe. Even though thickness and so on are different, it is common between East Asia and Western Europe, including Africa, that several bunches of some pieces of paper, including parchment, layered and folded together are bound together by threading through holes in the paper. There are differences in the number of holes and how they are threaded through, but these are improvements made according to hardiness of paper and the thickness of books.
西洋のコデックスの起源をどこに求めるかはやや問題がありますが、2世紀の初めにはキリスト教徒たちがパピルスをコデックスの形状にして用いたことが知られています。羊皮紙のコデックスは4世紀以降に本格的に使用されるようになったようです。エチオピアにキリスト教が伝わったのは4世紀と言われており、その際にコデックスの書物も伝えられた可能性があります。一方、中国には異端として追放されたネストリウス派がイランでの布教活動を経て東大の8世紀前半に伝えられています。中国ではこれを慶教と呼んでいます。西洋ではすでにコデックスが盛んに使用されていた時代に突入していますので、中国にもコデックスが伝わった可能性は否定できないでしょう。また、陸路や海路を通じて西洋と東洋は活発に交易していたのですから、キリスト教を介さなくてもコデックスが中国に伝わることは大いにあり得たことでしょう。中国や日本の鉄要素はアジアで独自に発明されたものなのか、西洋のコデックスの子孫であるのか、断定は難しい問題です。しかし、紙の両面を使用するのを前提とする想定であること、1枚の紙の中に保存されるテキストが連続せず、右側と左側で断絶しているのを基本としていることなどは、東アジア的であるようには思えません。中国の中心部であまり使用された形跡のないことからしても、西洋の書物の影響を受けていると考えたくなります。皆さんはどうお考えになるでしょうか。
There are some issues to seek the origin of codex of Western Europe, but it is known that in the beginning of 2nd century, Christians were using papyrus in the form of codex. Codexes for parchment seem to be used at full scale from the 4th century on. It is said that Christianity was introduced to Ethiopia in the 4th century, and there is a possibility that codex books were introduced at that time. On the other hand, Nestorianism, which was driven away as heresy, was introduced to China after missionary activities in Iran in the first half of the 8th century, the era of the Tang dynasty. In China, this sect was called Keio. That time, codexes were quite popularly used in the West. Therefore, we cannot deny the possibility that codexes were introduced to China then. Also, the West and the East were actively trading both via land and via sea. It's very likely that codexes were introduced to China even if we don't consider Christianity as the means. It is hard to make a clear conclusion whether Chinese and Japanese tetsuyoso was invented uniquely in Asia or it's a descendant of Western codex. However, considering this is a binding in which using both sides of paper is a premise, and that the text preserved in a piece of paper is basically not continued, but separated on the right and left sides, do not seem to be characteristics for East Asia. Also, from the fact that there is not much trace of usage in the central part of China, I want to think that there is influence from Western books. What do you think?
日本の前近代の書物史ではもう一度西洋の書物の影響の有無が問題になっている事柄があります。それは16世紀半ばに西洋と日本の貿易的交流が始まり、日本でキリスト教の布教を行うためにイエズス会を中心とする宣教師たちが日本にやってきました。そして布教活動の助けとするためにイエズス会の宣教師たちがヨーロッパから活版印刷機をアルファベットと日本語の文字の金属活字を運んできて、キリスト教関係の内容を中心に出版活動を行ったのです。画像は大英図書館のみに所蔵される有名な平家物語です。この本は見た目こそ西洋の書物の形態をしていますが、日本の紙を利用し、アルファベット活字ではあるものの、ローマ字表記で日本語を印刷しています。当時の発音や単語がわかるので、日本語研究上の重要な資料としても知られています。このタイプのものと日本の袋とじ層に主として日本の文字の活字を用いて、そのまま日本語を印刷したものとがあります。 このタイプは宣教師たちが日本の書物をどのように理解していたのかを考える上で大変興味深い資料です。
In the history of Japanese pre-modern books, there is another issue on whether Western books gave influence or not. In the mid-16th century, trade exchanges between the West and Japan started, and missionaries from the Jesuit and others came to Japan for missionary activities. And as tools for such activities, the Jesuit missionaries brought letterpress printing machines, the alphabet and metal type of Japanese letters, and engaged in publishing activities centering around Christian-related contents. This photo is famous, the tale of Heike, possessed only by the British Library. The appearance of this book is a form of Western book, but it uses Japanese paper, and even though alphabet type is used, it is written in Japanese words using Roman letters. Since it shows pronunciations and words used in that era, it is known as an important material in the Japanese language study. Besides this type of books, there is a type of books in which mainly Japanese type is used to be printed in the Japanese language using Japanese fukurotojiso. This type of books is a very interesting material in considering how the missionaries understood Japanese books.
これらのキリシタン版と呼ばれる西洋の印刷機で印刷された本が作られるようになって、ことへずして日本でも主として木製活字を用いた袋とじ草や鉄葉草の本が出版されました。これは挿絵入りで日本のひらがな書きの古典文学作品が出版されたものとして記念碑的な位置を占めるものです。またこの時期の活字印刷本は日本に商業出版を定着させた存在として非常に重要な意義を有しているのですが、これらの活字本に西洋の活字印刷の影響があるのかどうかについて議論があり、どちらと決定してもいません。
Soon after so-called Christian published books were made, books of fukurotojiso, and tetsyoso, using mainly wooden type printing, were published in Japan. This book is monumental due to the fact that it is a published Japanese classic literature written in hiragana with illustrations. Also, type-printed books of this period has a very significant meaning as something that helped establishing commercial publishing. But there still is an argument whether these type-printed books were influenced by Western type printing or not, which has not been concluded yet.
この問題について私なりの見解を論文にまとめたことがあるのですが、最近それを英訳した上に画像や表を付加してより分かりやすくなったものが日本の上智大学のモニュメンタ日本に歌詞に掲載されました。プロジェクトミューズでダウンロードできますので、興味のある方はお読みになってください。
I have written a research paper on this issue which surmises my viewpoint. Recently, it was translated into English with photos and charts added for better understanding and published in Monumenta Nipponica of Sophia University. This is downloadable at Project Muse, so if you are interested in, please go ahead.
宣伝になってしまいますが、MOOC のフューチャーラーンから慶応大学が公開しているコースに日本の書物に関するものが4つあります。このうちの3つの制作に私も関係しています。登録は無料ですので、興味のある方は覗いてみてください。
So this is my advertisement. There are 4 courses related to Japanese books offered by Keio University from MOOC's FutureLearn. I am involved in 3 of the 4 courses. Registration is free of charge, so if you are interested in, please take a look.
以上、大変駆け足になってしまいましたが、日本の前近代の書物の形態と西洋の書物からの影響の可能性についてお話ししました。日本の書物は使用している紙の種類や装飾が多様であり、写本も版本も挿絵入りのものが多いのが特徴でもあります。現在はインターネットによって世界中の書物の画像を容易に見ることができるようになりました。 書物の画像も多く提供されている日本のサイトをいくつか紹介して本日のお話を終えたいと思います。
I ran through pre-modern book forms of Japan and possibilities of influence by the Western books in a hurry. Japanese books have a variety of types of paper as well as decorations, and it is their characteristic that many of both published ones and hand-copied ones have illustrations. Thanks to internet, we can easily see photos of books from all over the world. Let me conclude my lecture by introducing some Japanese sites where many photos of books are shown.
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for interesting, wonderful lecture. Now, would you have any questions for him?
Please wait until you get a microphone because I can't hear.
You touched on this a little bit.
It's not on.
It was on.
Yeah.
It's on? Okay. I think you touched on this a little bit, but as more and more binding types entered Japan, were different types associated more with different classes of people? Or was there kind of a hodgepodge of who might be likely to own a specific binding type?
Okay, it's still hard to hear, but 今の質問はですね、少しお触れになったと思うんですけれども、いろいろな閉じ方があるということをおっしゃいました。これは、それを読む人の階層にも関係があるんでしょうか。それともそれはバラバラなんでしょうか。
関係があります。先ほど想定にヒエラルキーがあると申しましたけども、特に鉄要素と袋閉じは明らかに鉄要素の方が制作費も高くて高級な本ですので、それを利用する人はやはり貴族であるとか江戸時代の大名とかっていうその上級の武士であるとかっていう人が主に利用します。で、袋閉じはもっと大衆的な想定といいますか、一般的な身分の人も使える本でした。
So I mentioned that there's a hierarchy in those binding types, and for example, tetsuyoso, it costs more to make. It's a more high class books, and so those were read by nobles. And later in Edo era, daimyo or the high-class warriors, they were the ones who read those. And as opposed to that, fukurotoji is more for the general public.
これはその高級な鉄要素の例で、もうその表紙のデザインですとか中もこんなふうに金をたくさん使うとかっていうふうに、こういうふうな形で袋閉じとはちょっと違います。
So this is an example of tetsuyoso, and you can see that it uses lots of gold, and so it shows it's a high class, and so that is quite different from fukurotoji.
There is one question virtually, so just let me finish. I am very interested in the comparison of early codex structures, such as those from Africa, to Asian book structures. Do you have recommendations for further resources on this subject?
私はそのアフリカからのその初期のコーデックスと、それからアジアのものですね、それの比較に大変興味を持っているんですけれども、このことを調べるのに良いようなリソースはご存知でしょうか。
ちょっとアフリカのことは僕も少し勉強しただけなので、逆に教えていただける方がいると嬉しいです。
I studied the African one just a little bit, so I hope someone can help and let me know.
Thank you, Sasaki Sensei. I must say that I first got to know your scholarship through taking your FutureLearn, the MOOC courses. So I instantly became your very big fan. So I think for those who haven't gotten the chance to take the MOOC courses, I really highly recommended them. So I thank you so much for coming to Ann Arbor and to share your great scholarship. So I have a question about the illustrations in the pre-modern Japanese books. I think in some of the examples of the books you showed us, there are a lot of illustrations included in it. So I would like to learn more from you about, for example, the layout of the illustrations on the page. So, and then how the illustrations interplay with the text of the book. So, I mean, anything you could share with us about the illustrations would be great. Thank you so much.
先生のフューチャーランでのコースを取って大きなファンになったんですけれども、はい、
質問だけお願いします。
はい、アンナバーに来てくださってありがとうございます。で、私がお聞きしたいのはこういう伝統的な本の中のイラストレーションについてなんですね。で、私が知りたいのはこのイラストレーションの本の中のレイアウトがどのようになっているのか、そしてそれがそのテキストとどのような関わり合いを持っているのかというところを教えてくださったら嬉しいです。
大変大きな質問で、日本は絵本の国と言えるほど古くから絵を持つ本が世界的に見ても異常に多い国なんですね。でそれは最初は中国の影響なんですけども、その後やはり日本で独自に発展していった可能性が高いと思います。それでその絵とその本文の関係、レイアウトの問題もちょっと説明すると長くなるんですけども、古い時代は、ちょっと難しいですね。中国の古いタイプは同じ紙の中の上に絵があって下にその説明が来るっていうのが古いタイプで、そこからテキストがあって絵があってテキストがあって絵があるっていうふうなその関数層の絵巻の形態にこう変化していきます。でその時代を経て今度はテキストとその挿絵が同じ紙の中に同居するっていう時代を経て、またそのテキストと絵が分かれるっていうような時代がこうまた続いて変化したり、でそこにまた出版の時代が来て、でその出版と長すぎますかね、出版すると日本では絵を入れると本が売れるので、それで異様に絵入りの本が増えていくっていうような問題がまた生じます。ちょっとここで一旦。
はい。Okay, that is a very big question, and I can I can go on and on. But as you may know, Japan is known as the country of books, and especially the books with illustrations are very many. It's the big number, and so it originally came from China. However, in Japan, it developed on its own. And so talking about layout, in those days in China, the typical one is on top they put illustration, and then they put explanation underneath. And so that was the beginning. However, it was changed, the text first, and then the illustration, and so that is the form used for the rolled books. And then as time passed, it was changed so that text and the illustrations were on the same page, and then later they were divided into different pages, and then came the publishing era. And that time, the publishers realized that when they put illustrations, they could sell more books. And so that became very popular.
で江戸時代の出版物になると最初は絵はそのテキストの付属というか添え物だったのが次第に絵が中心の書物というものがたくさん刊行されるようになってで最後はですね今の漫画と同じようなその絵が中心でその周りに文字があるというふうな形にまで進歩していきます。ちょっとそう単純な問題ではないんですけども簡単に説明するとそのような感じになります。
And in Edo era, in the beginning, the illustrations were just an add-on to the text. So the text was the main thing. However, it was gradually changed that books have more and more illustrations. And it came to the point where it's like the modern manga where the illustrations or pictures were the main, and then around the pictures were some text. And so it has come to this era like that, but that's the very simple explanation of what you asked.
Thank you so much for this beautiful lecture, Professor Sasaki. And my question is about the 11th century, and what happened in the 11th century, because the century played a big role in your presentation about the bindings. And so there was such an efflorescence, such a sense of innovation, apparently, about the making of books. And I'm wondering what you as a book historian want to say about what made that possible, that transformation.
ね、私がお聞きしたいのは11世紀についてなんですけれども、今日の話の中でもその11世紀にそういうその閉じ方が決まってきたというか定型化してきたようなそういうふうなお話だったもんですから、なぜこの19世紀に11世紀にそのようなことになったんでしょうか。
これも大変大きな質問ですね。僕もあんまりそれちゃんと考えたことがなかったんですけど、今質問をいただいてすごく考えることがありました。でやはりそれは中国との影響関係で、特にその中国で宋の時代というですね、その王朝は非常に出版が活発化されて非常に今でも宋の出版というのは世界的に見ても重要な書物として認識されていると思うんですけども、それが日本に輸入されてきて、それまでのその書物の文化と新しいその出版を中心とする中国の文化とが融合して一つ大きな日本の書物の変革期になったのではないかというふうに今ちょっと思っております。
So that's also another very big question, and actually I haven't thought about it so much, but as you asked me that question, I think you need to think about the relationship with China, and that was the era of Song, and that was when in China the publishing became very popular, and so that was imported. Published books were imported to Japan, and of course before that Japan had its own book culture, and those two were fused and came to the situation in the 11th century. Yeah, it's coming.
じゃあカーと申します。一応日本美術史を研究しているもんで、今の質問は かなり曖昧でその立場から聞こうとするんですが、例えば筆詞の中には関数本と差し本はその絵の描き方とか表現し方には非常に大きい影響あると思うんですが、先生のお考えではそのなんていうかな、思想と閉じ方は思想史と閉じ方の書物史が直接関係あると思いますか？思いますか？
思想史、
思想史、
その仏教的な考え方とか。
仏教的だけじゃなくて、例えば絵を描くときには関数本の場合には長くなんかいろんなつながり作れるもんだけど、冊子本の場合には1枚ずつを書くのでかなりネガティブには大きい影響を与えるかなと思いますが、もうちょっと一般的には本を書くときには関数本と冊子本はかなり違うような感じで有名なIllustrations and Roland Codex とかそういうような研究によってちょっと面白いつながりあるかなと思います。
まず
私言いましょうか。
そうか。
Okay.
I'm just asking about in art history the scroll and a codex are quite different in terms of the way that art is made, and I was asking about the connection between thought and the way people think and how they write in a book versus in, say, a scroll.
先ほどの挿絵の質問をいただいたときにちょっとそこを説明し忘れたのですけども、今日の話の中でもその関数層というのは大変格の高い想定であるというふうにお話をして、その何でも想定で保存できるわけではなかったということをお話ししました。でその私がよく利用するその大きな例としましては、源氏物語は大変有名な作品なのだけども、当時のその仏教を重要視する考え方ではそのフィクションというのは創作は嘘なので大変罪深い存在であって、そういうものを関数層に保存するというのは基本的にしていなかったというようなことがまず確認できます。じゃあここまでお願いします。
So I didn't explain when there was a question about illustration. This kansu books or scrolls, these are, as I mentioned, the highest class, and it was not allowed to preserve books that way for everything. This famous tale of Genji, it was very popular then, but there was a tendency that Buddhism or Buddhist books were much more important. And Tale of Genji was just a storybook, that was a created story, and so it was not considered as important as Buddhist books. And I'll continue.
ところがその今国宝に指定されています源氏物語絵巻の存在のように、その源氏物語でも関数層になっているものはあるんですけども、その場合必ず絵がある。そうしますとその絵は関数層に保存するというルールの方が重かった、強かったんだろうと考えられます。
And earlier I showed you the scroll Tale of Genji, which is a national treasure. And that is because for kansu books, the illustration were used. And since there were illustrations in case of this illustrated Tale of Genji, that rule of using scrolls for illustrations or pictures took the precedence.
それでそのために日本では実は冊子体に挿絵が入るようになるのは世界的に見てもかなり遅れます。 16世紀の後半ぐらいになってやっと挿し体に挿絵が入るようになります。
So because of that, in Japan, for the booklet type books, codex, the illustrations were not used until the late 16th century.
それでその挿し体に挿絵が入るようになって、でやっぱりその先ほどおっしゃったような構図の問題さまざまに起こってきます。それで最初の挿し体のものは例えばこういうふうな横型のサイズで、挿しを作ることによって絵巻と近い構図の絵を入れることを可能にします。
So when the illustrations were put into the booklet type, the codex type, they had to think about the how to structure it. And so in the beginning, they used the horizontally long size. In that case, it's easier to put the illustrations like the scrolled books.
で17世紀に入って本格的にその絵巻と挿し体の絵入り本が同時に存在する時代になって、同じ挿し絵のその絵を比べるとやはりその縦型の挿し体にその挿し絵を収めるためのさまざまな工夫というか努力が確認することができます。
So in the 17th century, where the scroll, the illustrations and scroll books and illustrations and booklet type books were came out simultaneously, the people thought how we could put illustrations nicely in the vertically shaped books.
でごく簡単な例だけお話しすると、例えばテキストの中に100人の人が迎えに来たって書いてあるのに、絵はその絵巻だと割と多くの人数書けるんですけど、挿し体だと書けないので4人ぐらいで済ましちゃうとか、そういうようなことでいろいろ苦労しているのが認められます。
So this is a simple example. Let's say a text says that like 100 people came. And in case of illustrations in scrolls, they can put quite many people. However, in case of booklet type, they could only put like 4 people. And so that's where you could see that they were making effort.
ちょっと他にもいろいろな工夫があると思うんですけど、今思いつくのはそんなところです。
So I think there were other things that they came up with, but that is what I could think of at this moment.
I thank you for your good lecture. I have 2 questions. What were the conditions in the cave in China that made the very ancient manuscripts that were discovered in 1900 able to survive up to the present time? And number 2,
Could you do just one at a time?
Okay.
Yeah. 2つ質問があるんですが、まず最初の質問はその敦煌で1900年に書物がたくさんの書物が発見されたということなんですが、どういうふうなどのような状態だったんでしょうか。そして今日までそれが生きながら得ることができたのはどういう状態だったからそれが可能だったのでしょうか。
はっきりしたことは記録が残ってないのでわからないのですけども、いろんな状況からして非常に乾燥した岩山に横穴を掘ってそこを寺院にしてたんですね。でそこにおそらくイスラム教徒が攻めてくるということで、それで 紙の書物や何かを一つの洞窟に全部入れて、表を粘土で蓋をして塞いでいて、それが忘れ去られていたのが、たまたま1900年にその穴が少し粘土が取れて穴の中が見える状態になっていて発見されたと言われています。
There's no clear record, so we don't know well. However, it's a very dry area, and there were the side hall of this rocky mountain was used as a temple. And when they heard that the Islamic people were coming, they closed up that hall with the clay, and it was forgotten. And over the years, the clay came down a little bit, and then some people could see inside the hall, and that's how they found it.
And my second question is, what was the main century that the common people had access to books?
Which century did you say? What was
Yes, which century? That's the question.
Okay, yeah. もう一つの質問は、その一般大衆が、本にアクセスできるようになったのは何世紀ぐらいだったんでしょうか。
はい、先ほども少し、お話ししたんですけど、17世紀になって日本で商業出版が本格的に定着します。で、ほぼその時期ぐらいからかなり一般庶民も書物に接することができるようになります。で、もう一つその日本の書物のその一般の普及を考える上で重要なのが、日本では17世紀から貸本屋という存在があって、その本をいろいろ変化はあるんですが、おそらく買う価格の10分の1ぐらいで借りて読むことができるというようなそのシステムというか商売が存在していったことによってかなり広まったようです。
So the commercial printing became popular in 17th century, which allowed common people to read books. And also in the 17th century, there were rental bookstores where people could rent a book with like 1/10 of the original price. And so that helped populate the reading among common people.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a second question. It is a scintillating thought to think that a certain way of making books in pre-modern times traveled from West or the Middle East or Ethiopia to East Asia. Because when it comes to pre-modern times, we always think of the road going the other way, from East Asia to Europe. But I'm just playing devil's advocate, and I'm wondering whether you've considered polygenesis, sort of the fact that it may not be one place of origin from which a certain way of making books, sort of spreads around, but that there are several, and they may not be related. So I'm just thinking aloud and curious to hear you say something about it.
先ほど西洋とそれから東洋イーストエリアですね、そこで本の作り方に関して交流があったというふうなお話をなさいましたけども、先生ご自身がお考えになって、これはどちらにしてもどこかでまず一箇所でそういう本の作り方というのが始まって、それが広がっていったとお思いですか、それとも複数の場所でたまたまいろいろなその本を作って、それがお互いに影響をしていったという、そういう感じだとお思いでしょうか。
難しい問題ですね。
Very difficult question.
実は中国のその敦煌で残っているその鉄要素的な本の写真もいろいろ見てみると、一種類じゃなくていろんな工夫をしてるっていうか、いろんなタイプが確認できるんですね。だからその西洋から伝わったのそのままっていうよりは、なんか刺激があって、その中国の中でまたいろいろ試行錯誤してそれが日本に来るのか、それとももうそれは関係なく日本に伝わってくるのかって、本当にちょっと残された資料が少なすぎてなかなかその難しいところがありますし、その発明もその西洋におけるコデックスの発明っていうのももっと僕は知りたいと思っていて、ちょっとちゃんとしたお答えが今はできません。すいません。
So in China, I talked about the Dongwon. There were many books of Tetsuyoso. However, there are many types of Tetsuyoso there. And so I am wondering, it might have origined in the West, but with that stimulus, they thought of various things and trial error and came up with different types. But it's hard to say because there are very few materials that we could rely on. And I don't know about this codex in the West. I would like to know more about how it was invented there. So this is not the complete answer, but I am also wondering.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring, and I get more interested and inspired to learn, like the history, like how the skills transfer, how people interact each other. Just so inspired. Thank you so much, and let's join me to give him a big thank you again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.